Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to be able to speak with all of you guys today virtually about tomatoes. My name is Kiki Fontenot. I am the State Vegetable Extension Specialist for the LSU Ag Center, and I work with all vegetable crops, but we do a lot of tomato trials because they are so popular here in Louisiana. We usually try to trial tomatoes, not just in South Louisiana. I'm located down in Baton Rouge, but throughout the state as well. So we've done tomato trials on several different farms over the course of the number of years that I've been here. And why are we talking about tomatoes today? Well, they're popular. It's a popular crop throughout the United States. Per capita, or basically per person, we eat about 20 pounds of tomatoes per person each year here in the United States. So that's a lot of tomato consumption going on. We produce a lot of tomatoes as well. There's about 1.5 million tons of fresh market tomatoes grown each year in the United States, and about almost 15 million tons of processing tomatoes. So a fresh market would be like a slicer tomato you would chop up in your salad or put on your hamburger, versus a processing tomato, which would go straight to a canning company for ketchup or sauces or cooked and canned tomatoes. It's valued at a little over $1.5 billion here in the United States. That's commercial production only. Okay. Us home gardeners, we love growing tomatoes also. In fact, 35% of people in the United States grow a vegetable garden. Okay. And when you look at that 35% of households, that holds up very much the same here in Louisiana. And here in Louisiana, when we look at what vegetables we produce, now we're excluding potatoes, like sweet potatoes, out of this. But when we look at just traditional vegetable crops, tomatoes are our number one crop in Louisiana in terms of gross farm value of the vegetable crops. So this is definitely something that you guys are probably interested in. I'm definitely interested in, and the majority of vegetable gardeners, throw a tomato or two out in that garden, whether it's cherry or big or aromas, when you're going to can them or eat them fresh or however you're going to consume them. We do enjoy a homegrown tomato here in Louisiana. And basically, y'all, to understand how to grow the best tomatoes possible, we always have to go back to, where does this crop come from? Where was it originally grown? Where is its center of origin, right? Because the center of origin is a long story, but there was a botanist named Nikolai Vavilov. He was a wheat breeder, but he traveled all over the world looking for various sources of wheat. And in doing so, he noticed that different crops naturally occurred in different parts of the world. And what he coined this term center of origin. And basically, it's the part of the world where you still have a large number of wild relatives of any one crop species growing. And as he and other botanists were traveling the world, they noticed that the center of origin for tomatoes was in South America, specifically in the Andes Mountains, okay? And they found a number of wild tomatoes and tomato relatives growing in the Galapagos Islands. I can never say that word. Okay, what do we know about the Andes Mountains? Warm days, cool nights, okay? What do we not have here in Louisiana? Cool nights. We definitely have warm days, all right? Tomatoes are a warm season annual crop, okay? So they'll complete their life cycle in 1 year. What we don't get here in Louisiana is the cooler nights. So we have to pick and choose when we can grow tomatoes, even though we're like a semi-tropical area. So for our spring planting dates, we usually plant tomatoes March through April, okay? March 15th in South Louisiana. For you guys up in the Northeast section, you should really probably wait to put them in the ground until April 1st. You can put them in the ground earlier if you're willing to cover them up, all right? But the earlier you get your tomatoes in, so we could still plant them in May, okay? But the earlier you get them planted in, you get a little bit of cooler nights until it starts getting into the middle of the summer. You get less insect and disease pressure. So it's always nice to kind of go in early if you can. If for some reason you guys aren't prepared to plant tomatoes right now, but you're like, Kiki, I really want to plant tomatoes, you can always plant a second crop of tomatoes in Louisiana in the summertime. And we call those our fall tomatoes. We call them fall because they're planted in the summer, typically June. I usually like to wait till the end of July to plant mine because my spring tomatoes are still producing through June. So I'll plant another crop, usually mid to late July. And those are going to be harvested until we have our first killing freeze or first killing frost. So 2 different times we can plant tomatoes. After that, it gets pretty cold and they'd have to be in a greenhouse or some kind of high tunnel or protected structure to thrive in our wintertime. If you're looking to plant specific varieties, which we're going to talk about later on in today's lecture, then you would definitely want to order your seed well in advance. So if you're aiming to plant your tomatoes into your garden in April, early April, it's going to take you 8 to 10 weeks from a seed into a small plant, a little transplant. So you really need to start ordering or planting those seed, let's see, April, that would be March, sometime in February, right? But you really want to order your seed sometime in December because people throughout the world are calling the Rups and the Johnnies and the Twillies and the Totally Tomatoes and all those great catalogs and getting their seeds. So I joke around, but not really, and say for the spring garden, you should order your spring seed when you order your Christmas presents, all right? And that way you have the full extent of varieties out there in the market available to you to plant. Fertilizer is going to be very necessary to get you good tomatoes. If y'all are growing in pots or containers, then get a nice planting or potting soil that already has fertilizer in it. If you have soil in a pot that you've grown different plants in, for 1 or 2 or more seasons, then you need to add fertilizer to that container. If I were growing my tomatoes in a container, I'd want that container to be at least 5 gallons in size, like a 5-gallon bucket or larger. And because container plants are usually planted in medias that have a lot of peat moss, right? It's not like the mineral soil in your ground. You really want to go with an Osmocote or a slow release fertilizer, which is going to react better with peat moss when you're growing your vegetables. So any kind of like Osmocote Plus, Nursery Special, something like that. They're going to have labeled rates on the bag. Put that fertilizer into that potting soil, wait a week, plant your tomato, okay? If you're planting your tomatoes into the ground in the mineral soil, you cannot beat Triple 13. It's cheap, it comes in big bags, and it's really great. For Triple 13, if I were going to plant, let's say 100-foot row of tomatoes, I would go with about 6 to 8 pounds of Triple 13 distributed throughout that row. Now, you guys might be looking at me and saying, Kiki, we are not commercial growers, and we have a small home garden. We are not planting a 100-foot row of tomatoes. Well, let's back it down and say you're going to plant a 10-foot row of tomatoes. Then you would probably want something between a half a pound to a pound of that Triple 13 in that 10-foot row. And that's going to be a really good starting source of fertilizer to really make your tomatoes thrive and grow. Again, you put it into the soil, water or let the rain hit it, and then wait a week and plant your plants into the ground. When you're planting tomatoes, make sure that you space them 18 inches apart, okay? So anything closer than that, you're not going to increase your yields. You're going to increase the stress of the plants. They're going to be competing with one another for water, sunlight, nutrients, and you're going to have a lot of disease and insects setting in because the closer those plants are together, the worse the airflow is between the plants and the more niche areas you have for insects to hang out and hide and, eat your lovely fruit and eat down the foliage, which is going to ultimately reduce your yields. Tomatoes should be staked. They're very tough, durable plants, but when they have a good heavy fruit load on them, which is what I'm hoping you guys get, then they really need a rebar or a tomato cage or something holding them up. Now, I have the word plastic mulch highlighted on the screen. If you guys are going to grow a big home garden, or if you're commercially doing this, you've got to go with plastic mulch. As a home gardener, we love to let our tomatoes vine ripen, right? So like that top picture right there, we love our tomatoes to get all the way red before we pick them because we're really wanting to enhance the flavor of that fruit crop, right? Well, if you look down at those tomatoes, you have 2, 4, 5, that 6th tomato on the bottom left right there. You can see that that's at breaker point. It's kind of yellowish orange. It's definitely not red. Let's say typical Louisiana, late spring, early summer, we get a 4, 5, 6 inch rain come in. That tomato right there, if you don't have plastic mulch, that rain is going to hit your garden. It's going to go up through the plant and it's going to burst those skins. It is going to break open the skins. So if you want your tomatoes to vine ripen all of the way, and you know we're going to get a big rain event, go out and pick them. Do not let that big rain event come out, because when you come back out to your garden, you will have split skins. Or use plastic over the top of your raised bed or over the top of your row. That does not allow the water to penetrate the row. Instead, it sheds off the sides and slowly creeps back underneath, and then gets into the tomato plant at a little bit lesser, rate. So it's still getting water, but it's not like taking it in all at once. So the skins aren't going to bust. So that's really important. The other good tip I like when growing tomatoes is to sucker your tomato plants. So if you look at this bottom picture, the trunk of the tomato plant is going up to the right and the branch is coming down to the left. Well, that little sucker, or that little branch and leaf coming out at that 45-degree angle right there in the bottom picture, it is going to produce a lot of fruit, okay? So we don't want to sucker all the way to the top of our plant, but the suckers at the bottom part of the plant are going to get loaded with fruit and they're going to hang down low. Generally, that fruit sits on the ground and rots, okay? Or it creates a lot of foliage and again, it reduces that airflow and increases the niche habitat for insects to come in. So all I want you to do is pinch the suckers off the plant from the ground level up to the first flower cluster. That's very important on determinate tomato plants. Determinate tomato plants, y'all, are the ones that stay short, like the 3 or 4 foot tomatoes. It's going to say on the stake when you buy it or on the seed packet, determinate or indeterminate tomatoes, or I might call them bush type tomatoes. If it's an indeterminate tomato, like a cherry tomato or a lot of our heirloom tomatoes, then you want to pull the suckers up off below the 3rd flower cluster. So here's the ground level, your first set of flowers, your second, your third. Any of those suckers below that 3rd flower cluster should be pinched off. That's going to increase tomato size of the tomatoes you're going to get. It's going to open up airflow. It's going to allow you to pass through your garden more easily, and it's going to be just much better for you. Also, let's pretend we're one of those people who didn't order their seeds back in December. Suckering those plants is great for your neighbor who doesn't have tomato plants, because they can take the suckers that you pinched off and either start them in soil or in cups of water, and they'll reroot out and you have a whole new tomato plant right from that sucker. So here's another great tomato gardening tip, okay? Heat set varieties. Pretend you did not get your tomatoes out this April, all right, up in North Louisiana. So you waited and now it's May or June or July. Well, now, unlike the environment that tomatoes need, which is that warm days, cool nights, we have warm days and warm nights, or I should rather say hot days and hot nights, right? So what's going to happen if you don't have a heat set variety is that the pollen on that flower, like if you're looking at that top picture in the center of the yellow flower of the tomato, the pollen on that flower is going to become damaged when the nighttime temperatures become greater than 75 degrees, which we know is definitely our summertime nights, right? So if just a few of the pollen grains are viable and they shake down into that stigma and down the style and into the ovary and actually fertilize that flower, and you do get a fruit off of it, it's going to look like the fruit pictured here at the far right. Okay, let me try to explain this. It's hard to explain this without being in person, but like you see the tomato cut in the bottom part of the picture. See how when you cut it across the equator, you've got seeds all around the tomato. In order for that tomato to swell up and to ripen, not ripen so much, but to develop into a nice round fruit, you need pollen grains to hit every single side of that stigma and to go down and to fertilize every single one of those seed cavities. Anywhere that one of those seeds doesn't develop and isn't fertilized, you get a dent in the top of your tomato, like the tomato pictured on the far right. But if it, at some point, this tomato right here is completely inedible on the far right, because if you cut into that where all those dents are, you have this corky tissue and it doesn't taste good. So you can't slice and eat that. So somehow that poor non-heat set variety still made a fruit that's completely inedible. Most of the time what happens is the pollen becomes so unviable, so little fertilization occurs that the flower just falls off. And you have a big, beautiful tomato bush with lots of flowers that just keep falling off and they never make you fruit. And tomato plants are pretty, but we're really growing them to eat, right? So if you're going to wait until June, July, August to plant your tomatoes, and I would probably even venture to say May, I would go with heat set varieties. You know that they're heat set because their names connotate a hot name, like Florida 91. Florida is a hot place. Phoenix, right? Phoenix is a hot place in Arizona. Solar Set, Sunmaster, Sunleaper, right? You get the Sun Gold. Anything with the word sun, heat, hot, or a hot place is generally going to be a heat set variety. And typically on the tags, they're going to tell you they're heat set varieties also. So those are just some good tomato growing and cultural tips that you should use when you're growing your tomatoes. But, you know, there's lots of things we agree on in Louisiana, and there's some things that we disagree on. And probably the number one question when I'm talking to any home gardeners and even commercial growers in Louisiana is, what about a Creole tomato? You know, Kiki, why don't you talk about Creoles? Or what about Creoles? I want to grow a Creole. Well, the problem with Creoles is there's 4 different definitions of what a Creole is. The first is only tomatoes that are grown in Plaquemine and St. Bernard parishes. Those are known to have the good Creole soils. They have certain mineral content in them. It flavors that tomato. It makes that tomato taste better than other areas. We refer to this often as like terroir. Terroir, I can't say the word correctly, but y'all have heard of Champagne in France, right? Only certain areas in France can actually grow grapes that can be used to produce champagne. All the other grapes grown to make a champagne is just a sparkling wine, right? Because that area of France is known for its terroir, or the mineral content, or the special soils there that flavor the grapes that then make champagne, okay? So originally, the commercial growers in Plaquemine and St. Bernard Parish marketed their tomatoes as Creole tomatoes because of their soil types and the way their tomatoes were flavored. About 1969, LSU released a tomato, Dr. Tim Hernandez, and he named it Creole. So there was a cultivar named Creole tomatoes. That kind of added to the confusion because everybody thought like, well, I can just plant Creole tomato and I'm going to get this magical tasting tomato. But what they realized was the Creole tomato he developed didn't really have that good of a flavor, but it was really nice because of the diseases that it was resistant to, okay? Then nowadays, and actually for a long time, any tomato grown in the state of Louisiana is actually marketed as a Creole tomato. So if you look down at this bottom picture right here, we have Louisiana Creole tomatoes printed on the side of that box right there. Well, if you're a tomato grower and you're ordering what we call little boats, to put like 5 or 6 tomatoes in for the farmer's market type thing, it's going to automatically be printed with the word Creole on it. And I've gone to many farmers markets throughout the state, talking to farmers I know, and people will pass by and say, hey, are those Creole tomatoes? And they're like, oh, yeah, they are, because they know they're going to get a better price for it. I know that that's a Bella Rosa tomato, or that's a Better Boy, or a Celebrity, or, a Valente, or whatever they're growing, right? But it's a good marketing term. So people are just going to use it to market any tomatoes grown in Louisiana these days. And the final definition of a Creole tomato is always the one that you can never impress the person with. So a lot of us grew up, not me, but a lot of people grew up in Louisiana, right? And they remember Creole tomatoes as the one their grandmother grew in their garden. Now, their grandma wasn't growing the LSU released Creole tomato. She was growing maybe an heirloom, maybe an early hybrid, like a Super Fantastic or a Celebrity or something like that. Or Fantastic, not Super Fantastic. But you get my point. It's kind of like a nostalgic remembrance of the tomato that was grown back when you were a kid, and you remember that flavor, and you remember the taste, and you remember playing in the soil. And it's a really great memory that no one can live up to these days, okay? So there's all these different definitions of Creole. And we get questions about this constantly at the LSU Ag Center. So several years ago, I think it was in 2015, we went ahead and did a Creole tomato trial. So we went online, we went to different hardware stores throughout the state of Louisiana, we went to different plant nurseries, and we purchased 11 different seeds that were marketed as Creole tomatoes. And here on the left, you can see all the different places that they came from, right? We put those Creole tomatoes, if I flip back real quick, you see this picture at the top right-hand corner? That was from our Creole tomato trial. So we grew them out on silver plastic mulch because most of them are not resistant to tomato spotted wilt virus, which I'll talk about later. We put them on drip irrigation. We staked them. We tied them up. We gave them ample fertilizer. I mean, we treated these things like royalty, right? And what we noticed was all of these tomatoes, they were the LSU Creole tomato. They were the special Louisiana tomato. They were marketed as that. But when we planted them out side by side in the same field, on the right-hand side, you can see the number of days from planting them in the field to the first harvest. Some of them took 55 days to produce as the tomatoes, while others took up to 78 days. So you've got a difference of about 20 days just in tomato production across these different varieties. If we look across to the left and we look at total number of pounds harvested, you can see that it ranged on these plants, and there was 20 plants of each of the tomato varieties tested in the field, except for the Cherry Gal. We only had 3 of that because it just didn't survive. It just kept dying left and right in the greenhouse and then transferring it to the field. But you can see, so we're going to ignore that 5 pounds right there just because of the lack of plants. But you can see right here, we got anywhere between like 63 and 123 pounds of total fruit off those plants. So it almost doubled depending on what variety, right? Which Creole tomato you were growing. Then when we looked at the percent marketable pounds, typical of tomatoes, you know, you're going to have some rot on there from disease, or you're going to have some insect damage. So these were like perfectly perfect grocery store ready tomatoes. That ranged anywhere from 49% up to 89%, right? And then look at the average tomato size in that final column over on the right. So we had average tomato sizes anywhere from 4.2 ounces up to 7.8 ounces. So we're talking, again, a totally different tomato. We had little tiny cherry tomatoes all the way out to big, fat, juicy slicing tomatoes in this study. So what we know from this is, even if you go to the market or you go online or you go to the plant nursery and it says Creole tomato, it may or may not live up to the expectations you have in your head, right? I always joke around and say this is like the Loch Ness monster of gardening, because it's like something that you hear of. It's an old tale, but you can't recreate. Now, anybody listening to this presentation who is from St. Bernard or Plaquemine Parish already automatically hates me, because they still claim, and I'm okay with that, the fact that only they can grow Creole tomatoes because of the types of soils they have. If you're interested in this study or any of these, year after year after year, I have used what was Naylor's hardware store, but after the 2017 floods, Naylor's joined up with Clegg's Nursery on Segan Lane. I have used Naylor's, or now Clegg's, Creole tomato seeds in our trials for home gardeners. And year after year after year, they win taste tests. They do have a nice flavor. So in this particular 2015 study, the Clegg's now Creole tomato seed that they source always wins best flavor test. And 95% of the people who came through our tomato test that year, and there was like close to 250, 300 people, liked that one the best as far as flavors. So usually when you're going with Creole, you're thinking flavor. So I would recommend the Clegg's Creole tomato seed, but it's not going to be the same as something you're going to order online. This is not something that just was important in 2015. Year after year after year, we get this call. Most recently, Chef Dickie Brennan from New Orleans called, and he wanted some great flavored Creole type tomatoes, right? So we did a study for him down at Matt Renatz's place. He's the person in the top picture to the second to the left there with the blue shirt on and the white boots. We grew out several different tomatoes that were available in the 1960s, 50s, 70s at Matt Renatz's place. You can see them pictured right there in the center picture. And then we took them back to one of Dickie's restaurants and chopped them up, and all his chefs did a taste test, and they told us which one they liked the best. What I like about this study is now Matt Renatza and Dickie Brennan, buy and sell tomatoes from one another, okay? But the flavor, or the tomato that they liked best out of this one, was Super Fantastic. Super Fantastic seeds, you guys, that's a variety you can find easily online, and you can find easily in most plant nurseries or hardware stores. So Super Fantastic is another one if you like flavor. Along with Creoles, people are always asking me, well, what about heirlooms? Kiki, why do you never recommend heirlooms? What's wrong with heirlooms? They're supposed to taste better. Aren't they supposed to yield well? Why are they not prevalent in Louisiana? Why don't I see them at the grocery store all that often? And when I do, why are they so expensive? Why don't I see them at the farmer's market? Well, heirlooms, you guys, they're not Loch Ness monsters. You can find them anywhere. And like, if they say it's a mortgage lifter, it's a mortgage lifter. If they say it's a persimmon, it's a persimmon tomato. But the problem with heirlooms is they're very temperature or environmental condition, weather dependent, I should say. So we've done heirloom tomato trials in 2012, 2013, and again in 2017, okay? We always replicate each variety. We have many plants per replication. So in this case, we had 45 plants for each variety replicated out there in the field, always on plastic, drip irrigation, lots of staking and fertilizer, and just, good stuff going on. We really treat our tomato plants like royalty. Some of the tomatoes that we looked at in that study that I liked, okay, would be like this one, Thessaloniki, okay? Thessaloniki is a very nice tomato. It's a very small tomato. It's a very firm tomato. Absolutely no cap facing or distress on the outside of it. It looks like any other hybrid tomato that you would find, growing at the grocery store or growing in your backyard, right? So a lot of people, when they were looking at this one in the tomato trials, just by looking at it, it didn't have an heirloom appearance. And they're like, oh, that's not an heirloom. You're tricking us. That's a hybrid. But it wasn't. It's an heirloom tomato. I like Thessaloniki. The interior color was pretty. The exterior color was pretty. It did overall all well. And in fact, it was the top yielding tomato in that trial. Red Brandywine's pretty nice. When you cut into it, though, you get a lot of these white interior spots. I don't really care for that. I think most gardeners don't. And that's sometimes a variety thing, because a lot of our other tomatoes did not have those white patches inside of them like you see in this picture here. A lot of concentric cracks. So if you look down at the bottom right-hand tomato, you're going to see those cracks coming around the top of the tomato. You're going to get a lot of fungal growth in there. Heirlooms are going to be very soft. You can't double stack them in boxes. They tend to squish on each other. That's why you don't see them at the grocery store that often, or if you do, they're packaged in fancy packaging, right? So I wasn't too impressed with that one. This one, pink German, some catalogs will call it German pink. Other catalogs will call it pink German. That's why I have it listed both ways here. Nice, big tomato, a little bit of green shoulders on it. So it didn't quite ripen like you can see in the bottom picture right there. Didn't always quite ripen red all the way to the top. The radial cracks on it were pretty good, especially after a good amount of rain, which is going to be typical of heirloom tomatoes. So I wasn't too happy with that. Firmness was only fair. It just had a tendency to crack, and I didn't like that too much. Now, this mortgage lifter, I liked this tomato. It also cracked pretty easily, had a few interior colored spots on it, but it was an extra large plant with pretty big size fruit on it, and it had pretty good yield. So this one was one of the tomatoes I liked. I also liked the flavor on this mortgage lifter when we were going through and eating them. Persimmon, this one, you guys, beautiful, beautiful heirloom tomato, especially if you're okay with like an orange colored tomato. The color is like the name, right? You're going to see the radial cracks on it, but this was extra large fruit size, huge tomatoes on this thing. Very little disease, very big plant, very good foliage, just really withstood a lot of our summer and spring rains and that kind of thing. So I like this. But again, you're going to see some of this cap facing and radial cracks on it as well. All right. So we repeated this trial in 2013 with all these same varieties. Okay. And what we found was in 2013, we had a very short spring and a very early summer. So we got all the same varieties planted, 45 plants of each variety out there. And in 2013, it got hot quick. And when it gets hot quick and the nighttime temperatures stay hot quick, these tomatoes tend to make tons of flowers and then they just fall off because they're not heat set, like I was telling you about earlier in this presentation. So we barely picked any tomatoes in 2013. Like I wouldn't have recommended these to a home gardener in 2013. So they're good when they're good, but when the temperatures aren't good and the environment's not right, they're just not great. That's why I have a hard time recommending heirlooms definitely to commercial growers and have a really hard time even sometimes recommending them to home gardeners. So go ahead and plant them in your garden, but don't make your garden all heirlooms. Plant a few hybrids in there and plant a few of the LSU recommended varieties in there, just so you can have like what I call tomato insurance that you're going to get some fruit off those plants. Here we go again in 2017. You can see our tomato trial is planted in Wilson, Louisiana, all on silver plastic, trying to keep those thrips away from us. We planted all of these varieties that you see here: Cherokee Purple, Carbon, Conestoga, Nebraska Wedding, Persimmon again, Pink Brandywine Master, Red Brandywine Master. Those two are actually heirlooms crossed with hybrids. So they're kind of a mix, and one called Windsall. Well, guess what? Total flop. Those tomatoes, of all the varieties we planted out there, 50% or more had rotten spots or were severely cracked, even on plastic mulch, even with drip irrigation and fertigation and the best practices we could give them. I mean, when 50% of your yields are just cracked and rotting and terrible, I can't recommend that. So you may hate me, but I'm not going to recommend heirloom tomatoes to many people. Now, when we look at what we do recommend at the LSU Ag Center and what we do really like, right? Over and over and over again in all our trials, year after year after year, Bella Rosa, Mountain Spring, Mountain Merit. Excellent, big, meaty, nice interior colored, reliable tomatoes that are going to yield well. And I like them because they're determinate. The BHNs, BHN 981, BHN 1021, beautiful, big red tomatoes. BHN 876 looks like that persimmon, orange, tastes fantastic, really great tomato. Celebrity, it's going to be around for another couple of years, been around for a long time. We still recommend it. That Creole from Naylor's or Clegg's, I like it. Tribeca and Tribute. For a while now, y'all, a lot of our tomato spotted wilt virus resistant tomatoes have been going off the market because this isn't a virus that a lot of other states get, but Louisiana does, and we have to worry about it. Well, if seed companies don't sell enough acreage of one type of tomato, they cancel it out, no matter how much we like it in Louisiana or Georgia likes it or whatever. So we all have to like it in the Southeast United States. So we get enough acreage of it growing so that we continuously get this seed year after year. Tribeca and Tribute were two great varieties. I finally got, local stores to start carrying. And guess what? They took the seed off the market from the United States. Now they're only good in other countries because of the acreage they sell of those tomatoes in other countries. So if you happen to find those seeds, get them. They're great, but they're really hard to find. Sun Gold, Sweet Million, Chocolate Sprinkles, my absolute favorite cherry tomatoes. Excellent yields, big, vigorous plants, taste delicious, okay? Now, when we're talking about not cherry tomatoes, but big, huge tomatoes, out of our 2018 trials, the Skyway, which is from Seegers, Valente, and XTM 2261, which are cicada seeds, and the BHN 1021, which we got from Johnny's, all of these are tomato spotted, wilt virus resistant, and big, huge tomatoes. I kind of cut off the picture here in the bottom right, but that's my son, Jacob. And in his left hand, he's holding a softball. In his right, he's holding an XTM 2261. The Valente, the Skyway, the XTM 2261, bigger than softballs. Beautiful fruit. Taste great. And guess what? They're resistant to the virus. We're going to always have them here. You don't have to worry about silver plastic mulch. They're great tomato crop insurance. Put out all the flavors and the different tomatoes you like, but add one or two of those to your garden just so you can enjoy nice homegrown tomatoes every spring and summer consistently. Now, you guys are probably looking at me or thinking to yourself, she didn't mention Dixie Red. She didn't mention Tasty Lee. That's my favorite tomato. What's wrong with this girl? Look, we can argue all day about what varieties are the best in Louisiana. We've done trials. You've done trials in your backyard. It really doesn't matter, right? I don't want to fight with you guys about tomatoes. If you do want to fight about tomatoes, don't fight about the varieties. Go to Spain. I love showing this to my students when I teach vegetables here at LSU in the agronomy class. But there really are real reasons to fight. And just as a joke, kind of, and as for fun, trivia around the world, Buenos, Spain is a town, you guys, in Spain that has La Tomatina tomato fight every year in like the third week of August. It's the craziest thing ever, but this town basically only allows 20,000 people in for that day. You have to have a ticket ahead of time in advance. The town covers up all the storefronts with plastic, right? And they put a ham at the top of a pole and they grease a pole in the center of the town. And they shoot off cannons and the police are there waiting on the sides. And they bring in, like, I think it's something like 20,000 tons of tomatoes. And they have this huge fight where anybody can go and you just crush the tomatoes and you throw them at each other. It usually lasts a couple hours. They start shooting water guns and then you have to disperse. But to me, it's kind of funny. And when we fight about what's a Creole, when we fight about should you plant heirlooms or not, when we fight about what varieties are the best, I always like to just bring this up. This is a true tomato fight. In La Tomatina, if you go to the website and you actually buy tickets to partake in this tomato fight, they have rules. Don't rip other people's t-shirts. I've highlighted a few of them for you guys here. You have to squish the tomato before you throw it to reduce impact. Do not wear flip-flops. You will lose them during the battle, right? Keep your t-shirts tucked into your pants. That way, when too much tomato juice gets in your eyes, you can untuck the portion of your shirt that's still clean, wipe your eyes quickly and tuck it back into your pants. Don't bring cameras if you're worried about them getting dirty. Do not throw the tomatoes at the police officers. Get your rooms and your reservations months in advance if you actually want to stay in a hotel close to this. But it's just a really funny, cool tomato fight that I have never heard of us doing anything like this in Louisiana. Maybe it's some kind of tourist or agritourism event we need to invite here. Tomato fights, you guys, have been happening for centuries, okay? Not just in Spain, but everywhere throughout the world, even here in the United States. And one of the things that people fight a lot about is a tomato a fruit or a vegetable, right? And so this is something that I like to bring up for fun, but people think, oh, Kiki, you're just joking around. Botanically speaking, a tomato is a fruit because it's seed and it's a fruit, right? And it's ovarian tissue that encompasses seed. So scientifically, botanically, yes, it's a fruit. We classify it a lot of times as a vegetable because it doesn't have a sweet flavor. It has more of a hearty flavor, right? And so when we're talking to a chef or someone who owns a restaurant or cooks a lot, they're going to say, well, a tomato is a vegetable because it has, a hearty flavor, not a sweet flavor. A gardener is going to say, no, it's a vegetable because botanically it really is ovarian tissue. Well, this argument of should a tomato be a fruit or a vegetable actually went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And I always think it's kind of funny to bring up, but Nix versus Heaton, right, which was basically a person, Nix, imported fruits and vegetables from other countries and other states into his shop to resell, right? In 1883, there was a tariff tax that was passed, and they were going to charge 10% tax on all imported vegetables. Well, Nix was like, you can't charge me the 10% tax on my tomatoes because tomatoes are a fruit, they're not a vegetable. Local courts didn't side with him. It kept going up, all the way to the Supreme Court. Well, guess what, you guys? The Supreme Court ruled a tomato is a vegetable, not a fruit. Even though in the dictionary, botanically speaking, scientifically speaking, a tomato is a fruit, they go and they say that people go with the more common vernacular or the common terminology. And because more people think of a tomato as a vegetable because of its flavor, not because of how it's grown or what it's made up of genetically, then that's the definition they went with. And Mr. Nix was forced to pay the 10% vegetable tax on the fruit crop that he was importing into his store. So I think it's kind of funny. And it kind of, gets brought up, even though that's 1883 and, all this kind of stuff. You're like, whoa, you're digging in the past. But if you look up today, USDA rules on what specialty crops are, they're going to tell you it includes fruits and vegetables. And they're going to go into this whole, some things you may classify as a vegetable, but they're really fruit. And they still, if on the 2021 stuff, they cite this Nix versus Heaton trial in explaining why tomatoes can be considered vegetables. So I wanted to make this talk short and sweet because y'all don't want to hear me talk about tomatoes. Y'all want to go out and plant tomatoes on, right? So instead of talking about fighting about tomatoes and which varieties are my favorite versus yours and all that kind of stuff, I think we can all agree on the fact that you guys need to go out this spring and this summer. April is right around the corner. And you might even be listening to this talk in April, and you need to plant your containers and plant your gardens with tomatoes. Pick new varieties, choose things you've never grown before, and experiment in your own backyard. Pick some of the LSU recommended varieties though too for insurance, right? To make sure that you're getting that great flavored tasting tomato. I hope y'all enjoyed this presentation. You have great county agents in your area. You guys have Carrie Hefner, Donna Lee, Carol Pinnell, Allison, Marcy, and several others. I know I'm forgetting someone and they're going to be mad at me, but you'll have great resources up there in the Northeast region. If for some reason you need my help, go ahead and email me, kkfontno@agcenter.lsu.edu. I'm here to talk to tomatoes with you. See you later.